This conference will now be recorded.
Right. I
Yeah,
think
yeah, I forgot the same.
I forgot, I think, a few recordings for other batches. Okay. So in which ways, today somehow I remembered that I have to record as well. Uh, all right. Let me go ahead and open this business object called worker. Now we have already discussed uh, the properties of a business object, right? Basically all the fields with which I can go ahead and build my reports. Okay. Uh, I think this will take a bit of time to load. All right. So we understand what is a field, right? There are a number of workday delivered fields, but then we'll also see how we can build our own custom fields or our own calculated fields, right? At this point in time, what I am interested in is this third tab, which is basically the data sources. Now, if I look at my custom report, basically one of the three required fields that I have to specify is a data source, right? Now the question is, what is a data source? We understand what is a business object, right? A business object basically represent all your data in workday. So I have a worker business object which represents or allows me to basically create instances of workers. So again, I have this worker business object which defines all the properties of the worker, including hire date, date of birth, gender, first name, last name, and all the other properties. Now I create instances of this business object, right? So every employee that I hire in my system, right? Uh, every contractor or a contingent worker that I hire, right? Is an instance of the worker business object, right? Now my employees could be in different statuses, right? My employee could be active, he could be terminated, he could be retiree, and so on and so forth, right? Now uh, I am building a report, right, wherein I need to extract details of all the terminated workers, just as an example, right? So again, I have a requirement uh, wherein I have to build a report to basically check the details of all the employees who are terminated, right? Voluntary, involuntary, for whatever reasons, in, let's say, in the last 1 month, right? Now I have a workforce of let's say 10,000 employees, right? And so these are all instances of the worker business object. So I have 10,000 active employees as of today, right? uh, and I have 2000 terminated employees, just as an example, right? So I started probably in 2010 or 15, and since then 2000 employees have been terminated, right? Okay, so now my requirement is to just pull the details of employees terminated in the last 1 month. Now, what is a data source? A data source is basically a pre-built filter available on the business object, which then allows me to only pull in those records which I need. So when I only need terminated workers, for example, I'll check, is there a data source which is available which pulls only the terminated records into my report. What is the advantage? Now the moment I select that appropriate data source on my report for terminated workers, the report will only query those 2000 workers, right? And out of those 2000 workers who are terminated, then it will only bring those workers who are terminated in the last 1 month, right? So now if you see, my scope of query is very much reduced. So instead of querying all 12,000 employees in my system and then checking how many of those 12,000 employees are terminated, and then checking how many of those terminated employees actually got terminated in last 1 month, system is only querying those 2000 actually terminated employees. So my report performance is much faster, right? So if I go ahead and look at these data sources, and these are all workday delivered data sources, so I cannot go ahead and create any data source on my own. All right, so if I look at the first data source, it says all active and terminated workers. Now, what is a data source? A data source basically brings instances of that business object, right? That is all it does. And it puts a filter as to only bring the relevant instances, right? So if I see here, it says accesses the worker as its primary business object, which is correct because this data source is on the worker business object itself, right? And what does this data source do? It will return one row for each worker, right? So one row of data for each instance of the worker that I have in my system. But then it says it only includes active and terminated workers. So any other worker status, inactive, retiree, or any other status, it will not even return in my report query, right? So my query executes faster, my report executes faster. It takes less amount of resources to go ahead and execute in terms of time, but also in terms of memory and resource space. Okay, similarly, if I look at all retirees, now again I have to build a report only for retirees, right? And there could be just 1% of my population could be retiree. For that 1% population, why should I be querying all the other 99% of my population, right? So I'll only use this data source. Again, every data source, it returns instances of the business object, right? The difference is how many instances would it return. So this data source again accesses worker as its primary business object and returns one row for each worker. But here it will only include those workers who are retirees, right? Again, let's take a few other examples. Now I am building a report for for my manager self-service, right? Wherein manager can, for example, view the compensation details of his employees, right? So which means if I manage 10 employees, report should only return those 10 employees to me, right? Now, if I just need to read 10 employees, again, report should not be querying all 100,000 of my workers. So I have this data source called my direct reports. Again, the data source accesses worker as its primary business object, returns one row per worker, but then it only includes those workers who are associated with the supervisory org which I manage. So this data source basically checks who is executing that report, checks if this employee manages any supervisory org, and then only returns those employees who are members of those supervisory orgs that person manages. So if I'm running this report, it will check if I manage any supervisory org or not. If I do not, it will just bring me blank results. If I manage one supervisory org or two supervisory org, or if I am a manager of 10 supervisory orgs, then it will check all the members of those supervisory orgs and give me details of only those supervisory orgs, right? So my direct reports, my direct and indirect reports, and then you have all these data sources available, right? So you get a requirement to build any report. The first thing you decide is which data source best suits your requirements, in the sense which is the smallest data source which includes all the instances that you want to report on or query on, right? So you'll go for the smallest instance and not the biggest instance, right? Because that means decreased performance. Okay, when deciding on the data source, obviously you go through the report description, see which data source fits your bill, right? But then there is one more aspect that you will check. You'll check the data source type. A Workday delivers two kinds of data sources. One are your standard data sources, and the second one are your index data sources. Now there's no difference in any of these data sources, whether standard or indexed, uh, in terms of how you build a report. So if you use an index data source or a standard data source, when it comes to building a report, both are exactly the same, right? The difference is your index data sources, they are optimized for performance, which means your report output or your report performance would be much better, right? And when I say much better, I mean it could be a given report takes 10 minutes and an indexed report could probably give you the same data in the process of in 1 minute or maybe less than that, right? So it makes a huge impact on your report performance. So the first thing that I'll do, I'll check if there is any index data source available which can handle my requirement, right? uh, but then there are not many index data sources available. If you see, if I filter on index, probably there are only, right, so if you see, there are just 3 index data sources out of 54, right? So I'll start with an index data source. I'll see if there is. Now if I look at this index data source, it says accesses worker as its primary business object and returns one row per worker, right? It includes all active and terminated workers, right? So instead of the data source that we had analyzed at the top, the name of that data source was all active and terminated workers, and that was a standard data source. So if I plan to use a data source to report on my active and terminated workers, I would much rather build my report on this particular data source because this is an indexed one, right? Though in terms of report output, both would give me the exact same output, right? So I'll see if there is an index data source available which can handle my requirement. If there is, I would prefer that. If there isn't an index data source available, then I would go for a normal data source, right? Now for example, I have this checkbox selected called optimized for performance. Now when I search for all active and terminated workers, it says there's no such data source which is available. However, when I unselect this and then search for it, right, I'm getting this data source, right? Because I had selected that I want to build a report which is optimized for performance. Workday was not allowing me to select any data source which was non-indexed, right? So it gives me an error, an alert saying using non-indexed data sources, right, may lead to slower performance. Consider using optimized for performance mode. So when I've selected optimized for performance, I would only be able to use index data source, and then there's no other difference. Okay, uh, let me go ahead and build a report, right? So I'm calling it WB 13 to 20 uh, employee details, right? We'll talk about what is this enabled as a web service later. Okay, so I've selected my report type, I've selected or entered my report time, I've selected my data source. Based on the data source I've selected, Workday defaults the business object, right? Because this data source, all active and terminated workers, it is available on the worker business object, right? Now I can still change my data source, but now I can only select those data sources which are available on my primary business object, right? So I realize that no, I should be building my report not on worker, probably on a different business object. Now I'll not be able to change my business object, right? So I'll have to delete this report, create a new report, right? So I can change a data source, but then all these data sources are part of the worker business object itself. right? Okay, so now once that is done, the next task is to go ahead and, sorry guys, uh, excuse me. Excuse me. All right, so the next task is just go ahead and uh, include the fields that I want to include. Now Workday has different field types and we'll talk about them. For example, last name, right? Now when I search for a field, system shows me an icon besides that field, which allows me to identify the field type. Now this icon called T, it means this is a simple text field, right? So if I go to the details, it says this is a field of type text, right? Okay, so on the other hand, and if I go to the additional actions, it also gives me additional details. So this is the last name of uh, the person. Okay, instead if I search for worker, right, now the icons that it shows me are completely different, right? For example, it shows me some barbell kind of icon, and then this is a ring kind of icon. Right now if I click on here, right, it is a self-referencing instance. Now first let me see here, show here. Now this icon, right, a dumbbell kind of icon, right, it identifies that this is an instance field. Right now what is an instance? An instance is basically what we have already discussed. So Logan McNeil is an instance of the worker business object. Now what is the advantage of using an instance? I can go ahead and perform additional actions on it. I can pull additional data from that instance, right? Let me show you an example. So I'll include last name, right? I'll include first name, right? So both of these are simple text fields, right? So if I go in here, again, this is a field of type text, right? And then I am also including worker. Now, what I'll do is, now when I search for worker, you see that I get two worker records, right? Or two worker fields. The first one is a workday delivered field, right? It's a single instance, but then it is available on a business object called project resource, and the description says it is a worker on the project resource, right? Now I don't know what project resource is, so let's see what does this second field say. Now this field is actually available on the worker business object itself. The description says it identifies the worker and enables you to view and access related details and actions on the worker, right? The field description says, or the field type says, it's a self-referencing instance. Give me a second, sorry. Sorry. Now this is an instance, or this is basically a field which identifies the business object itself, right? So I have a worker business object and I have a field within that business object which identifies the worker itself that I'm referring to, right? So this is also an instance, but then it is a self-referencing instance, right? An instance which refers back to the business object itself. Again, we don't have to worry, there's no difference. The only reason I'm using this field is because this field identifies the worker, right? It is available on the worker business object. On the other hand, this field is available, or it gives me the worker who is available on some project resource. Now I don't know what that project resource is, so I'll go ahead and select this field, right? I'll go ahead and click OK. Now, there are two ways to run a report. I can either run it in test mode, wherein it only pulls the first 10 or 11 records. So I want to quickly test something. It is much more easier to run it in test mode, right? So let's say there are 10,000 records, and every time you make a change and you run it in full mode, it will probably take you 5 minutes to execute that report, right? So you want to quickly test something, go ahead and click or run it in test mode. If you see, it has delivered for me uh, the first 12 records, right? Even though there are many employees in the system. Okay, now if you see, because these are text fields, I cannot drill down, right? I cannot, uh, these are my simple text fields. So I cannot go ahead and click on them. They are not hyperlinks. I cannot get additional details. Now, because this is an instance field, I can directly click on it and it launches and shows me the details of the worker, right? So an instance field is basically, it refers to the instance of that particular business object, right? In terms of details, if you see, both of them are giving me exact same data, right? So both of them, I'm still getting the same information, whether I use this field or these two fields, or I may also concatenate both these fields, and we'll talk about how that is done. And it will basically give me all my data in a single column, the way this field does, right? Okay, so a difference between a normal static field and an instance field. Okay, let me go ahead and expand this report. So I'll come to the business report and edit it, right? Let me go ahead and remove these two fields, not required, just wanted to show you. If I want to add a new field, I'll click on this plus icon. I want to remove a field, I would uh, click on this minus icon. I want to reorder my fields, click on these icons to move up and down, right? Okay, I want to show, let's say, the manager or the immediate manager of the employee, right? There is this field, again, field of type instance, which identifies the immediate manager of the worker's primary position, right? Okay, I want to identify, let's say, date of birth of the worker, right? Now here you'll see that the icon is different. Now this icon basically identifies that the field is of type date, right? So again, a workday delivered field, the description says it gives you the birth date of the worker, right? So I'm going to select this field. Okay, I also want to identify, let's say, the length of service of the worker in terms of years. Okay, length of service uh, in years, including partial years. Okay, let's go to this field. Now this icon over here identifies that this is a field of type numeric, right? So your age, your length of service, what else? Your compensation. These are all numeric fields, right? Again, what does the field say? Uh, The field says that it identifies the length of the service of the worker, including partial years represented in terms of two decimals, right? So it will show me 5.2 years, right? Uh, there is another field which says, it only gives me, so is there another field? Length of service in years rounded up. Okay, this is a calculated field. Don't worry about it. Okay, no worries. I'll select this field. So we have looked at an instance field, and these are instances. This is a date date field type. This is a field of type numeric. We have also seen a field of type text, right? Let me quickly run this report. Okay, so this gives me date of birth. It gives me the length of service of the employee, including up to 2 decimal places, right? As the report mentioned. Now, because now I'm running this report in full mode and not test mode, it basically gives me details of all the employees in the system. Give me. Okay, let's go ahead and further enhance this report. So I'll add one more field and then we'll build some modifications on top of that. So I've added date of birth. Let me add age of the employee as well. So again, age is a numeric field, right? So worker's age, workday delivered, field of type numeric, right? All right, and it gives me the age of the employee, right? Okay, now I have a requirement, right? I have the date of birth of the employee. Uh, okay, not age. So I have the age of the employee, a workday delivered field. I have the date of birth of the employee. Let me also add the hire date of the worker, right? Again, pretty standard workday delivered field of type date. All right. So all these employees basically um, created when the system was created in GMS. So they're all hired effective 2000, right? I can probably sort them in ascending order, right? Okay. So they're all hired from 2000, sort in ascending order, which is strange. Why is it? Okay, sorry, sort in descending order. So 2020, uh, so their length of service is only 0.03 and so on and so forth. Okay, uh, now I have a requirement. Now, why is age empty for these workers? Because their personal information has not been entered, right? Now, I want to basically only pull those workers whose age or date of birth is specified, right? So all these workers who do not have their age or date of birth, I do not want to show those workers on my report output, right? Now, based on the data source I have selected, it is basically giving me all active and terminated workers, right? But then on that existing filter, based on the data source, I now want to design my own custom filters saying out of all these active and terminated workers, give me only those employees whose date of birth is not missing, right? Or who have a date of birth value specified. I'll go back to my report, right? Let me go ahead and edit this. I'll go to my filter And here I'll go ahead and add my custom filters, right? So what is my requirement? I only want those workers who have a date of birth value, right? So I'll go in here, I'll select date of birth. Now this, if you see, is again exactly the same logic as to how we build our compensation eligibility rules, right? Or our business process condition rules. So I said date of birth, and in the operator I'll say is not blank, right? So pull me only those workers whose date of birth is not blank or not empty, right? Now let me go ahead and run this report. Now if you see, out of 880 workers, it only gives me those workers whose it only gives me data for 489 workers, right? Let's sort this in ascending order to see if there is any employee whose date of birth is missing, and this basically no employee with blank date of birth, right? Okay, now I have another requirement. uh, Basically I have the age of the employees, I have their hire date, I have their date of birth, right? I basically want to know, and just a hypothetical example, I want to check the age of the employees when they join my organization, right? So at what age are my employees joining my organization, right? Now how can I pull this data? I can basically pull this data by subtracting the date of birth of the employees from the hire date, right? So if I subtract their date of birth from hire date, it will basically give me the age at which they joined my organization, right? Now this is not a workday delivered field which is available, right? In this case, I can go ahead and build my own calculated fields, right? And how do I do that? The task for doing that is create calculated field, right? So with calculated field, you're basically enhancing the workday's delivered business object and adding your own custom fields to define some additional properties of employees or instances in that object, right? So whenever I build a calculated field, I'll basically be doing that on a business object, right? So I'm selecting worker, right? I would give a name to my business object, or sorry, to my calculated field, but before that I'll specify the function. Now what is that I want to do? I want to basically subtract two different dates, right? Or subtract one date from another, right? So for that, let me just search with date and we'll talk about a lot of functions. So I basically want to find the difference between two different dates, right? So as I would select the function called date difference, right? I'll go ahead and give a name to my field, right? So most different organizations follow different naming conventions or different patterns of the naming convention that I'm going to mention, right? So usually most organizations they would start a custom field or a calculated field with CF, which identifies that this is a calculated field. Then the the function, so it is date difference, right? Then the business object on which that field is built, so here the business object is worker, right? And then a short description of that field, right? So I'm saying what is that uh, difference. So I basically want age of employee during hire or at hire, right? So again, CF identifies that this is a calculated field. This is the function I'm using. The second part, then the business object on which that calc field is built, and then a short description. What is the advantage? Just looking at the field name, I know at a high level what that field does, right? I'll click on OK, right? Now a date difference, uh, give me a quick second, I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay, so basically I date difference, it determines the whole number of years, months, or difference between two dates or times, right? So what is my end date? It is basically higher date, right? From higher date I want to subtract date of birth, right? And I can show the difference between these two dates in terms of years or months or days, right? So I'll select in which parameter do I want to find the difference between these two dates, right? Then it says it only gives you the whole number of years. So difference, if my age was 20 years and 10 months, it will basically give me 20 years, right? So it doesn't give you those fractions as the difference between two different dates, right? Or if my age is uh, if my age was, if I want to show that age in terms of months, it will again go show me whole months, right? So it will show 200 months, for example, right, and not 200 months and 15 days, just a hypothetical example. So I want to find the difference between these two dates in terms of years, right? So build my calculated field. Let me copy this and go ahead and edit my report. So custom report, edit. Okay, let me add it here. Right, so this is my calculated field. And now when I go ahead and run this report, it basically shows me the difference in terms of years. So from 1970 to 2000, it is some 29 years and few months, right? Again, from 1959 to 2000, it is some 40 years and few months, right? So it is rounding to the nearest whole number, right? Uh, okay. Again, the age of the employee, his date of birth is 90, hire date is 2019, so it is 119 years, right? Okay. This definition, or the name of the column of over here, it makes perfect sense for a technical resource who wants to understand what that calculated field does. But for an end user who's running this report, he would get absolutely no clue based on what this column title says, right? So instead of showing this default column title or this technical name, let me go ahead and overwrite the report name or the column label, right? Uh, So if I go to my report once again, so here I can override the column heading, right? So here I am saying, so just to keep track of how many calculated fields we have worked, I'll just mention it as date difference, right? And let me go ahead and do OK. and run once again. Right now, it says date difference. Right? Obviously, if this is a live report, then I'll give a meaningful name. Right? All right. So that was the first calculated field function called date difference. Right? We'll go ahead and explore other date related functions as well. Excuse me. All right. If I search for date, let's see what other functions are available. Uh, okay. Now, we'll talk about date constant later. It is pretty standard, pretty straightforward. Let's look at build date. Now, build date function allows me to go ahead and build my own date from data which is already available in the system, right? Okay, let's look at an example. So I'm calling it, building it again on worker business object, right? So CF uh, build date on worker, right? And because this, I would just name it as 13th Feb, right? Again, as I mentioned, if you are working for a project, you'll basically give a meaningful description as to what that particular calculated field does, right? Here I'm just mentioning it as 13th Feb, uh, and I'll go ahead and do OK. Now, what is this calculated field? Build date, right? Now the description says it allows you to build a date or time field from the date or time components which are already available in Workday, right? For example, a date includes year, month, and day, right? So I have different options to go ahead and build my year, my month, and my day. So let's say for my year, I want to basically specify a constant value called 2020, right? So here I have specified a specific value for year and I'm calling it 2020, right? For month, I want to extract my month from another date field. So I'll select this checkbox. So let's say my month, I want to extract from the higher date of the worker, right? And my day, I want to extract from date of birth of the employee, right? So let me build this report and then we'll see how this actually looks in the output. So right, so I'm saying year is 2020, a constant value. The month of this date would be extracted from the higher date of the worker, and the day would be extracted from the date of birth of the worker, right? Let me go ahead and copy this calculated field and change our report. Okay, what I'll do is for now I'll remove all these fields which I don't require, right? Okay, I'll move this down. Okay, so these two are standard fields. This was my first calculated field, right? I'll add this calculated field that I've just built and I'm calling it build date again just to keep track of how many functions we have already seen, and I'll go ahead and do OK. Now when I go ahead and run this report, all right, now let's look at this build date function, right? So what does this function do or say? So for year, everywhere we have specified that the year of the date would be constant of 2020, right? And that is what I get. So everywhere in my year, it is basically constant value of 2020, right? Okay, next I'm saying extract month from the hire date of the worker. So what is the hire date of the worker? It is Jan 1st 2000. So here the month of this date that I have built, it is extracted from the hire date of the worker, and the day I have extracted from the date of birth. So what? Okay, so if I look at the date of birth worker of the worker, what is the day? It is 21st, right? Which is what is extracted to go ahead and build my date, right? Again, let's see if I have some other examples. Here, everywhere the employee date, hire date is 1/1. Okay, let's look at here, right? So again, my year is 2020. My month is extracted from hire date, which is October, which is what comes here. My day is abstracted from date of birth, which is 5th, right? So my date is October 5th, 2020, right? So I can go ahead and build a date by using a combination of numbers and dates which are already available in the system. All right. So building most of these calculated fields very straightforward, right? When you get a requirement, you uh, the most important thing is you understand which calculated field is used for which purpose, and then once you understand that basic requirement, you see that most of them are very straightforward. Okay, let's explore a bit more on the date fields. So the next date field is format date. Now, as the name itself suggests, I can basically use this field to format my date, right? So I want to show this date in terms of uh, year and month and and YY, or week and year, or any of those formats. I'll be able to do that. Okay. Uh, Again, my business object is worker, and cal field format date on worker BO, and again I'm calling it 13 Feb. Okay, so which date field do I want to format? I Now the best part about your reporting framework is that I can go ahead and build nested calculated fields, right? So I have built, for example, this field, which is basically a date that I have built. Now I can take this date field and format the output of this date into using this calculated field function called format date. So I can copy this date field, and let me go ahead and do that. So I'm saying this is my date field which I want to format, right? And I can format that in terms of, let's say, year and quarter, and year and month, and quarter and year, and month and day, and I have all these standard formats which are available. For example, let me select month slash day and do OK, and then we'll go ahead and change it once again. I'm copying this, editing my report, and I'm adding this field, right? So now basically it is exactly the same data, but then I'm formatting it and showing it in a different format using my nested calculated fields, right? So my function that I've used is format date. All right, now if you see what was the format I had selected just show me month and day, right? So it shows me month and day, right? Let's go ahead and change this format. Instead of month and day, I want to build my own custom format. So I'll select the option called format mask. The moment I do that, I have the option to define my own format. I bring my cursor over here. You see that I get a pop-up wherein it shows me the options to build my own format, right? Okay, so for example, I small d, it identifies the day in a month. So I'm saying small d hyphen MMM, which stands for uh, month, and then uh, I would add YY, which stands for year. And then if you see capital D, it identifies day in a year. So let me add these brackets and show day in a year, right? Okay, let's remove year because everywhere your year is constant, right? So this is my format in which I want to show my date. I'll say okay. The field is already included the moment I run this report the next time. So if I refresh this, right, now system automatically shows me the data in the right format. So it is 25th Jan, so 25th day of the month and 25th day of the year. If I scroll down, so these are all Jan employees. Let's look at an employee from a different month. Okay, so if you look here, 24th Feb, so 24th of Feb, which is basically the 55th day of the year, right? So 31st, 31 days in Jan plus 24 days in Feb, which is 55 days. So what is the format that I have selected? I had selected, so if you see here small d, it stands for day in a month, and capital D stands for day in a year, right? And it said D hyphen month and then day in a year, right? So I can go ahead and build my own custom formats. So now I am basically showing this data that I have extracted with the help of a build date calculated field function into a specific format by using my format date calculated field function, right? So if I go ahead and remove this column called build date, your end user would not even know that this is basically a field that you're pulling with the help of two different nested calculations, right? Okay, so the next calculated field that we have looked at is format date. uh, any questions till now?
No, all good so far, Ali.
Okay, let's look at what else is there. All right, again, we'll talk about increment or decrement date later. Let's look at lookup value as of date. All right, let me go ahead and edit this report once again. Hmm, I'll add a field called manager level 1, which basically shows me my immediate manager. And let me go ahead and do OK. Let's run this report. All right. So the manager for Logan McNeil is Steve Morgan, right? Manager for Steve Morgan is also Steve Morgan, Oliver Reynolds, Steve Morgan, and so on and so forth. Let's look at some of these employees. So James Moore, manager is Jacqueline, right? So if I look at James' profile, his manager is Jacqueline. Let's go to job details and manager history. So this basically shows me all the manager assignments of the employee. So Jacqueline is basically his manager from 2008 till today, right? So from 2008 till today, till 2014, he was probably in some position, and then from 2015 onwards. But in both scenarios, the manager is still the same. So before 2008, from 2007 till 2008, his manager was Pedro Santiago, right? Now, when I'm running this report, it is basically giving me the current status of the employee. So what is or who is the current manager of Betty Liu or Norma Chan or basically all these 489 workers, right? But then I want to build or see who was the manager of these employees, let's say as of 2007 or any other given date, right? So I don't want to see the current status of these employees, but rather I want to see the manager level 1 details of these workers as of any given date, right? And in this case, let's take 2007 because that way we'll be able to validate. But then, as I mentioned, this could be any date based on your business requirement. So in that case, I'll go ahead and build this function which says lookup value of a field as of a given date, right? Again, I'll specify the business object as worker, right? And CF lookup value as of date. I'm using the short form called LVD or lookup value space date worker and 13th Feb. Okay, now what is the value or value of which field do I want to look up? I want to look up the value of manager level 1, right? So manager level 1 as of a given effective date, right? Now if you see there are two dates, one is effective date, one is entry date, right? So I may be performing an action as of today or making a data entry today which would be effective as of a- any other date, right, in the past or in the future. For example, I'm creating a position today effective 1st of April. So the entry date is today, but the effective date is 1st of April, right? So do I want to pull the value of manager level 1 as of a given effective date or as of a given entry date, right? Here, I'll go ahead and use my date constants, right? A date constant, as the name itself suggests, is basically the constant value. And for that as well, I can go ahead and build a calculated field function, right? Let's see if there is a date constant already available. I'm checking 1st of Jan 2007. There's no such date constant available, right? So I'll go ahead and create a calculated field directly from here. So create calculated field, and when I search for date, I want a date constant. So I'll select date constant, worker, right? And all your constant values, you basically give it the same name as the value itself. So my requirement is to build a constant called 1st of Jan 2007. Let's see. Yeah, no. 1st of Jan. Let's do it 1st of Jan 2008. So I'm calling it 2008 and do OK. And here, because it is a date constant, I'll go ahead and build date constant, right? Assign a date constant to a field. And this is all I'm doing. Now this is another calculated field that I have built of type date constant, right? Now I'll go ahead and do OK. Let me add this field onto my report. Again, I'm calling it lookup value as of date, just so that we can know uh, what all we have already covered. Let's run this report. Okay, let's look at Maria, right? Her current manager is Hema, but as of 2008, it shows the manager was Logan McNeil. So let's open Maria's profile. So I can see that her current manager is Hema Iyer, which is what it shows me. Let's go to her manager history. As of 2008, so from 2000 till 2019, her manager was Logan McNeil. So as of 2008, her manager was Logan McNeil, right? Let's see a few other examples. Norman Chan, current manager is Betty. Uh, as of 2008, manager was Maria Cardoza, right? Again, so current manager Betty Liu, manager history 2008, which is here, manager was Maria Cardoza, right? So it is giving me value of that very field as of that date, right? I think we were looking for James Moore, right? Let's see what value has been pulled for James Moore. Let me filter. So James Moore, right? So current manager is Jacqueline, and the previous manager as of 2008 is Pedro Santiago, right? So lookup value as of date allows you to go ahead and do reporting on the historical data in Workday. Okay, so we have spoken about date difference, build date, format date, date constant, lookup value as of date, right? Increment and decrement date, a few other calculated field functions we'll talk about later, right? Uh, okay, let me stop here. Um, let's not rush because there are so many functions which are basically very similar to each other and confusing, right? So I'll stop here. We'll continue with this in tomorrow's class. Questions?
Ali, is
Mhm.
there any trigger which functions like when the report is generated, it will be mailed to any particular user?
Yes. So I can go
I
ahead and
guess
schedule a
we
report.
need something on
So
it.
right. So any
Okay,
report which
okay,
is
okay.
scheduled in the background, right, or uh, therein, I can go ahead and specify the recipients of that report, right? Uh,
Yeah, I
report.
guess we have looked something like that in the business process steps, something like that.
Right.
When we added this
Exactly.
step
Right.
regarding the reporting.
So that
Yes.
is what I mentioned there, that recipients can only be specified for a report which is run in the background. Either you do that manually or you process it through a business process, or it is some report which is scheduled to run on a daily basis, right? Any scenarios, whenever a report runs in a background, I can specify the scheduled recipient of that report, and it will be delivered to their my report. We'll go ahead and see how that is done.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Uh,
All right. Thank
all right.
you.
No problem. Sure. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining. We'll connect again tomorrow, same time. Bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye.